we have a lot of thinkers about how should an equal or just digital society look like, but there are only a few people who think about it and also do it and establish alternatives. And this is important for, I think, the first question that I want to ask you. We're coming from this festival at Leuphana University, where a lot of young students thought about, what are ideas, how we can shape the future, how can we make a difference. And at some point in 2006, you entered into Google. And maybe how was this process from entering the organization to becoming engaged in collective action, actually changing something about it?
So I think the process was very, very organic. I joined Google having no real interest in technical mechanisms, but having a humanistic background, an art school background, and then I was just trying to figure out what was going on for a very long time as the company metastasized, as the business model moved from something that was a little easier to justify. We're just doing search. We'll never show ads. We are a steward of people's information, because if we weren't, we'd lose customers. And this is why you can trust the market to surveil, but you can't trust government. All of these kind of platitudes of common sense that were very, pervasive when I joined began to break down as the metastatic requirement for forever growth in profits and revenues, the sort of metastatic capitalism that governed the Google paradigm, brought those red lines closer and closer, those horizons closer and closer. We'll never be a military contractor, but then 10 years later, that's where the money is. So I lived through the growth of the surveillance advertising business model and the establishment of these massive platforms. And at some point, I had figured out how to get myself into a spot where I was running my own research group. I had a massive budget that I was channeling off to cool projects outside of Google, trying to, micro redistribution. And I was known inside and outside the company as a pretty vocal critic that often took a line that was very distinct from Google's. So it felt like I was doing something, because I was allowed to speak. I was, often speaking directly opposite, our CEO, saying something different. But what I began to realize is that I was, the term I coined for this is dissent court jester. They're fine having me in the room, but when the decisions are made, they're not listening to me. Being right was not a strategy. It actually enhanced their image to have people like me around, because it looked like a very pluralistic environment where all voices are listened to, but at the end of the day, they were looking at the bottom line, and they were moving in the direction, the objective function dictated by that bottom line. So what is the classical response to consolidated capitalist power, right? It's worker action.
And what the moment, how do you organize collective action in an organization that has no history in collective organizing?
I mean, how do you do anything? You get on a group chat on Signal with your friends and you say, hey, this thing's really messed up. You guys want to try something? You guys want to write a letter? You know what? We know that guy in cloud. Let's contact him. He might know something. Oh, he's really disturbed. Okay, well, can we get on a call at 9 p.m. after his nanny comes? Okay, let's get on a call. Let's talk about it. Okay, well, oh, wow, the letter blew up. Oh my God, there's 5,000 signatures. Oh shit, this contract is bigger than we thought. Oh my God, there's thousands of people joining our Zoom, or, Signal video calls, because don't ever organize on a insecure platform. And it's not a plan. It's a experiment that you put your heart into, and then you see who else is with you. But it was I think I was drawing from history, because I was like, what else has ever worked, right? What else has ever worked to sort of check this kind of power when again, everyone agreed with me. That was not the problem. It was just that the imperatives were not the imperatives of kind of the empirics of social benefit. They were in the empirics of they were the the imperatives of shareholder-driven capitalism that is now governing these, massive information platforms, these massive surveillance corporations, jurisdiction in the U.S., which we should all be concerned about.
And you already mentioned Signal, and who is using Signal here?
Thank you. We love to see that.
So I'm not going to ask the question whether it is. I think people better, but this notion of how do you build, maintain, and I would say following the last 2-3 weeks, the discussion in the media periods is you also made an Austrian TV, and I'm from Austria, so I saw it of course as well. How do you defend the integrity of the mission that you pursue?
Well, one of the ways we defend the integrity of the mission is we structure ourselves so that we take an inside threat just as seriously as an outside threat. So if I decided I wanted to be a yacht-owning billionaire instead of a person with a soul connected to the world, and was like, okay, I'm going to sell Signal to Palantir, right? I couldn't get rich off that because the 501c3 nonprofit structure means that we would be required to reinvest that money into a mission-driven cause. So that's one barrier. Another barrier is we develop in the open, where open source is sort of a licensing contract. The reason we develop in the open is so that any changes made to our code, to our binaries, to what we're shipping, is scrutinized. Another reason is that we is not exactly structural, but it has to do with our history. Signal was created, there's a number of dates because obviously software, you build software, you change it, you fork it. So when is the beginning, it's hard to say, but in the late 2000s. So if we reverse in history, like it feels like 100 years, the iPhone had just come out. Smartphones weren't ubiquitous. There was no WhatsApp. The competitors were like Jabber and Google Chat and Gmail. There was not a saturated marketplace. There was no iMessage, right? Or no Telegram. So when you're building a communications app, or service or system, network, the value of that network grows in proportion to the quantity and quality of the nodes connected to that network. So because we were developing in the open, because our cryptographic protocol, the Signal protocol, was, enabled privacy on mobile messaging, which wasn't possible before, it gained a lot of attention. It was hammered, it was attacked, it was scrutinized by the best InfoSec security researchers there are, and that has happened for 10 years. So we have that legacy of trust, and we were able to build a user base over time, which would not be possible now, because it's very difficult, kind of impossible without sort of monopoly levers to introduce a communications app into a saturated market, because doesn't matter their ideological commitment to the beauty of your technology or the privacy provisions, they can't use a communication service that friends don't use. And that is the real issue. So there's a number of ways that we've built trust over time. We get audited yearly. So any change that happens inside would be seen. And then finally, we use cryptography to protect data, not promises. And that means it's also protected from us. It's protected from the people who operate the servers we run on. It's, just jumbled strings that make no sense to anyone who doesn't have the key to unlock those. And we do that we do that for the contents of your messages, what you say. So, what I text you, like, hey, what's for dinner? And that's the Signal protocol, which is pretty famous and used across the industry for that. But we've also developed novel cryptographic techniques that protect intimate data about who you are, who you talk to, who's texting whom, who's in your group chats, who's in your contact list, what's your profile photo, et cetera, et cetera. And particularly in an age of powerful influential AI systems, that data is as, if not more valuable, and we're the only large-scale messaging platform that actually protects that. So it's really important to recognize that true privacy requires that comprehensive approach, and that approach, again, is protecting that from us, as well as authorities, as well as hackers, as well as surveillance capitalists who might want to scrape that data.
And And to fund operations, you use donations. And how hard is it to maintain sufficient level of donations that you can, run your operation?
Well, Signal costs about $50 million a year to operate, 50. Which when I tell that to a nonprofit person, their eyes bulge out and they're like, what on earth? That's so much money. When I tell that to a tech person, they're like, whoa, you guys are lean. So what I'm saying with that number is that, one, the surveillance business model is incredibly profitable. It's eye-wateringly profitable, and we ignore capital and the material analysis of tech at our peril. Two, there's a reason there are so many hypothetical prototypes for tech for good and so few actual working examples, because no one funds it. That's any funders in the room, take that to heart, please. And, I think, Signal has a very unique history. It also has just, had a virtuosic founder, Moxie Marlinspike, and Trevor Perrin, who's a cryptographer who worked with him, who really, developed some incredible technology that has stood the test of time. And we, are developing on that legacy, kind of retaining those standards. So our reputation in tech is really good. And because everyone uses us, everyone has to use us. We're the only large-scale, truly private communication service. And this is a long way around to your question, but it means that we have a number of people in tech who are often, they may have made their money kind of feeding the beast, but that also means they're very sensitive to these concerns. They've actually seen what happens when, an order from police and a national security letter comes in and you have to give up sensitive data. They understand these dynamics at a blood level. So we get a lot of donations from those folks. We also have a large enough user base that a small percentage of the many, many millions of users who are on Signal donating like $5 a month is actually pretty significant. And we're working on other models, looking at, is there an endowment structure that could be a model not only for Signal, but for sort of independent tech that can combat, not compete, because we don't want to do what they're doing, but combat and rewrite, I hope, the tech paradigm that's coming out of the US and Silicon Valley. And can we think about, what would it actually take to establish endowments and real funding, not sort of change every, 2 years where you can't promise people long-term benefits. You can't hire people who are at a very high level and retain them. You can't really do the thing that needs to be done. So I think I'm optimistic, particularly as people and states are getting more and more sensitive to the dangers of the current model.
Great. And now that we've kind of addressed some of the concrete details of what you do, I'd like to take a big step back and ask maybe some philosophical questions about tech, society, democracy, and how these interrelate. And the idea of these big questions is there's no way you'll be able to answer them in 5 minutes or 10 minutes or even a day or a month. But the idea is to give us some orientation points, some thought markers, ways we could be thinking, ways that it's problematic to think. So that's the spirit of my question. That should be taken in that way to manage expectations. And the first to get us situated is, what do we mean when we use the concept artificial intelligence? So of course the concept has been developed a while ago. A lot of things has happened. And my sense, and I don't know if you share this sense, people are using the term more and more and more in sloppier and sloppier ways. Sometimes I feel like people now use AI when they used to use tech, or they refer to algorithms as AI. And I'm wondering if you could help give us some clarity to this concept. Is it a good concept? What does it mean? Are there uses of the concept that are particularly problematic or serve, let's say, an ideological function? So can you kind of help us through the weeds of artificial intelligence?
Oh, man. So I was just at the hotel polishing the talk I'm going to give tonight for the awards, and it literally has a historical blow-by-blow of why we can't trust this term, why this is a marketing term, not a technological term of art, and why I don't believe there's any non-sloppy way to use it, because it is an anthropomorphizing term that is sort of an umbrella over a heterogeneous set of techniques and aspirations, not a specific term of art. And I remember in 2010-ish, it was 2012 was when this blew up, and I'll go into that in the talk for those of you who are there. And then Google, you know something's blowing up when every single, the OKRs at the company level, which are the goals you have to meet, are, suddenly include this like buzzword. It was mobile, then social, then AI. And they were calling it ML. It was machine learning in Google. And then suddenly there was some marketing decision to switch it over to AI. And, which is a much more powerful narrative. If the derivatives of our surveillance business model and our monopoly on compute can be sold as intelligent, generalizable tools, like bingo. We are in every industry there is. We are threaded through governments and infrastructures, and then you have Rishi Sunak simping for Elon Musk because these guys have become more powerful than nation states on some axes. So I think we really have to check this narrative and its anthropomorphizing force, because these are pattern matching statistical techniques that are able to see, trends in surveillance data, but that is not a reflection of our complex dynamic reality. And in fact, it's often a mismap of the histories of, internet toxicity, the histories of our unequal, misogynist, racist histories and presence that then get mapped as objective, as justifying inequality as biological destiny. So I think we need to be very careful.
Yeah, maybe kind of picking up on this, we all know that there's a growing acknowledgement that there's something going awry in tech, and we know about discrimination and algorithms and the like, but as someone who's really inside the industry, are there developments that we probably don't really know about, or kind of most people don't know about, that are really disturbing and that you would like to share with us and inform us about?
It's like we've been like brain melded, because there's actually, I go back to the talk that some of you will probably see later. I think the transformation of these surveillance and platform giants into military contractors is one of the most disturbing things I've seen. And this was actually what catalyzed my organizing and pushback. Was there was a contract that Google signed with the Department of Defense to build AI drone targeting and surveillance systems for the drone war. And anyone who knows what a signature strike is there anyone? You don't have to, it's a little arcane, but a signature strike is basically ad targeting, the logic of ad targeting. So your data patterns look like people who have bought a bike in the past. And so based on your data patterns, we're going to assume you are a bike lover and we're going to show you an ad. That's the logic, right? And it's often wrong. You get weird ads, you've already bought it, whatever. But it's that for killing. So the signature strike basically sort of introduced this concept that based on data patterns and statistics, not based on knowledge of human beings, we can go ahead and assume this person is a militant. We can assume they are terrorists, deeply Islamophobic assumptions baked in here. And we're seeing similar technology now marketed by these companies and by smaller companies that sort of ride on top of their clouds and AI. And currently, thanks to investigative reporting by 972 in Israel, we know that the Lavender AI system is using exactly this logic for targeting, and not only of individuals, but of the buildings they live in, which helps explain the death toll and helps explain what we've witnessed there. So I think, irrespective of who's using those systems, we have to be very disturbed that the logic of your data looks like this kind of data, and we assume this kind of data is a dangerous person, leads to justifications for killing, for whatever.
So the more and more we come to this recognition that there are deep problems with what's going on in tech right now, we're also seeing a bunch of regulations now emerging. Just in March, there's the AI Act in Europe, and then there's the case against Google happening in the United States. This is a kind of attempt now to regulate AI. And in your work, you call out, you use a concept called industry capture, where like a seemingly progressive solution is actually just then taken over by the industry. So what seems to be progressive ends up not really being. So we can kind of pat ourselves on the shoulder and say, yeah, we're regulating, but Do you see hope in these regulations? Are they nowhere near radical enough and we have to really rethink our strategies?
I think that, I need to caveat this. I'm not involved in the day-to-day of the AI regulation. I work with people who are, but as the president of Signal, I'm pretty focused there, and then I do academic work on planes in the evenings. So I don't have the texture of exactly what's going on, exactly the definitional fights that are happening around the AI Act and the DMA and other things. But I think what I have seen is there's an unwillingness often to attack the business model, right? And I've used this example before, but GDPR, which I think has another acronym in German, but that's the data protection law from the European Commission. If you read the text of the law, it very easily supports a full ban on surveillance advertising, which would cut at the taproot of this business model, completely interrupt it and force a radical transformation of this toxic paradigm. But no one is enforcing it that way. And in fact, no one is really enforcing it that much. What you see are fines levied against these companies that cost them about as much money as their money makes in a millisecond. So you're not actually checking them. They don't like it, right? But it's not shifting the paradigm. It's not forcing a change. Similarly in the US, I think there's some FTC precedent that's very interesting. Model disgorgement is a kind of wonkish remedy, but this basically meant that if you collect, create, steal data in an illegal or privacy invasive way that crosses some legal boundary, and you train an AI model on that, you can't just keep the model and throw away the data. You actually have to trash the model. And if we think about that remedy in the context of aggressive copyright claims against the, some of these generative systems, in the context of, the certain, certain privacy invasion that is going into the kind of scrape the whole web, use that all of our surveillance data paradigms, I think we need to, see that as a potential. But again, it's less about the rules on the page in a lot of cases and more like who is going to take the risk to enforce them, given that there is serious pushback. Like I can tell stories over a coffee about my time at the FTC, and it was just, you're constantly FOIA'd, you're constantly harassed, the right-wing papers have your face in there, and there's, clear campaigns when you're seen as potentially effective to try to stop this. So I think it's, we need to recognize this is a fight against power, and power retrenches. And that, again, I would also caution against sort of solutions that sort of bolt monitoring and more surveillance onto the side of tech. Like, we're going to leave the platform business model alone, but we're going to put a government monitor of content on the side of it, right? Like that's sort of extending the logics of surveillance and monitoring and kind of algorithmic curation into the government and often civil society sector without checking the model, and again creating a target for politicization and possible abuse as we move into more authoritarian times.
Yeah. So the mind mouth continues as a great segue to my next question, which is, stepping away from the details of regulation. When we think about regulation, we can ask, well, who's regulating the regulator? And is the regulator doing a good job? If we're looking at our current societies and our democracies, what we're seeing is also a democratic deficit. So the people making those decisions don't always have like a robust democratic legitimacy. And so I'm wondering if you could reflect very broadly on how might our democracies have to change such that regulation of AI could be meaningful. And kind of alongside that, one thing I often hear today is we need to democratize AI. And that sounds amazing, but is that something we could actually think about doing? Is that you're shaking your head. Is it unrealistic? Is it a utopian dream? Can we get there? There's steps we need to take. Does the phrase democratize AI make sense?
Yeah, that's a big one. So I would, first we would need real democracies. And I'm serious about that. I would follow Perry Anderson in sort of defining what the U.S. has as electoralism, not pluralistic democracy, particularly following Citizens United, which was a couple of Supreme Court rulings on two cases that opened the floodgates for anonymous campaign financing. So that we know who pays for that. We understand the interests at work there, and it is we can look at the history of the last 8 or so years since those decisions came down and see their scarring our, juridical landscape, our regulatory landscape, our electoral landscape. So I think we should take democracy seriously enough to demand a real form of it, and not, I think a lot of the disaffection we see is that people have conflated, two packaged candidates and the choice between them without a real choice of like, who is our leader, who represents us, who's going to sort of, fight when the power plant comes to dump sludge in our backyards, or when the algorithms come to determine that we don't get social services or whatever. They have been told that that is democracy. And so when you see people sort of turning to anti-democratic methods or being disaffected with that process, I think we should take that seriously, not assume that they're stupid or lazy, but that there's actually sort of an issue with the process itself. Not that, of course I vote, right? It's the floor. But, what other forms of democracy exist? There's sort of workers' councils are a form of democracy. There are sort of, community-led movements that can exert democratic pressure. There are, local forms of democracy that I think are exciting, particularly now, to experiment with in the U.S. and elsewhere. In the U.S. is my context. So I would offer that, and I would also say I don't, democratize AI is sort of, it's often slapped on top of things that are like, let's sign a multi-billion-dollar contract with Google as a government, and then give researchers access to the cloud compute we just bought from this giant, right? It's not actually like looking at what AI is or whom it serves. And I think when we talk about AI, we're talking about, again, the form that the marketing term is taking now, which is not always historically the same, is these large-scale, surveillance-centric pattern recognition systems that require eye-watering amounts of computational infrastructure that can cost, the GPT-3, I think, was $100 million for one training run, and you do more than one. And then you have to pay for the labor. And the labor is fundamentally necessary. It's inextricable. You have to have human beings, usually in the majority world, who label this data and or who kind of calibrate a generative system to make sure it's not spewing out, racist, hateful, offensive, dangerous things. And they're kind of the human buffers between that. Because if you're going to market this system to, another business or a government, it can't be doing that. You're not going to make money on that, right? So there's a huge amount of human labor, also not democratic. And then there's the cost of running these large-scale systems. So even if you pull kind of an open binary off of Hugging Face of one of these large foundation models, and you want to run it, inference for AI, the process of actually using AI to make it spit out an answer, prediction, determination, is really, really expensive. It's way more expensive than just regular information retrieval. So there's an estimate that running ChatGPT for a week is like $100 million. We don't know because we don't, the economies of scale at Microsoft are really tricky. But nonetheless, we're not looking at any of these inflection points of something that can be responsibly called democratic. Even if I can examine the training data, I can pull the binary down, but I don't have the power to use it, right? This is a very expensive, very centralized technology that is, because of its cost and because of the resources pooled in the hands of a few monopolies, are generally only available to those already in power and are generally only used on those who have less power. So employees, citizens, etc. So I think we need to understand that paradigm and not assume this is just technological progress that like grew some apples and we can all pick the apples off the tree. And if we're smart enough, we use it and make money. And if we're not, we go about our lives and are subject to it.
Yeah, that's really helpful, this idea of not just slapping on democracy on a system that is kind of anti-democratic at its core, and then yet still thinking, okay, well, what might it mean to have a kind of democratic AI in some sense, or democratic technology? And then I would like to ask you, because Signal is one example of something happening in tech that's establishing like a parallel world to kind of the existing structure. And there are lots of these initiatives cropping up. And I think kind of one problem of the present is we're rightly so focused on the problems that we miss that there are kind of alternatives, like small experimental alternatives of, let's say, digital democracy kind of rising up. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit, beyond Signal, if there are initiatives like that you see in the tech world that are that have democratic potential, that could be seeds of democratic futures?
I think there are a lot of good ideas. I would say I would hesitate to call Signal democratic. We should be pretty clean with our language, and Signal is I'm a leader at Signal. If I make a call, it goes, right? But we are accountable. We are transparent. We reject the surveillance business model. And so we're at least honest about what we do. We don't have a PR department, right? I'm just sort of offering you my thoughts here, right? So there's a lot that we can do that others can't do. And I think there are, a focus on, I don't want to say more localized infrastructures, like we all have our town message boards and can't interconnect with people. But I think, rethinking, is there a social wage or another way to support kind of baseline network infrastructure, which is what it was in the US until the 90s when it got turned over to the commercial sector. Is there a way, telecoms were sort of, monopolies, but they were regulated monopolies. Are there ways of thinking about sort of offering that infrastructure and then having community networks or hubs or things that are kind of governed by local communities that can interconnect with larger systems? I think there are some pretty exciting work on smaller AI models, but again, I want to focus on the data processes of AI, because data isn't just a natural off-gas that represents our reality accurately, right? It's the product of methodological choices and measurements that are made by humans to answer specific questions. So I think there's actually some exciting things around, if we want to know about ourselves as a group, as a community, as a, whatever, how do we choose to know that? How do we measure it? How do we kind of democratically determine our methodological choices so that data is reflective? So it's not just answering questions that are interesting to advertisers and the bottom line, and then that gets sort of transformed through some transitive property of tech capitalism into a mirror of the world. But we're actually trying, through a much more empirical and much more, I think, interesting process to create those artifacts. And then we can think about, are there models we want to use with them to detect those patterns in life and other spaces? So I think, they're that would be really exciting. I don't know of an initiative doing that. I do know of, kind of democratic tech. I know, there's a lot of, the entire internet is built on open source libraries and infrastructures that, could be sort of supported and, rehydrated is the term I would use, and, thought of differently. But it would, again, it would take not trying to mirror and compete with what's happening in Silicon Valley, but actually asking the question, what do we need to build a, climate-friendly future? What do we need to, have, positive social relations? What do we need for real democracy? And then asking, does tech serve that purpose? Or are there other things that serve that purpose? And if tech does serve that purpose, how do we do that in an accountable way, in a way that's transparent?